This politics of meaning is anarchic in the literal sense of unruled, not the popular one of unordered. As each of the essays in the whole volume shows, it is in its own way what I have elsewhere called the struggle for the real, the attempt to impose upon the world a particular conception of how things at bottom are and how things at bottom are and how men are therefore obligated to act is for all the inability thus far to bring it to workable institutional expression, not a mere chaos of zeal and prejudice. It has a shaped trajectory and force of its own. The political processes of all nations are wider and deeper than the formal institution designed to regulate them. Some of the most critical decisions concerning the direction of public life are not made in parliaments and presidiums. They are made in the unformalized realms of what Durkheim called the collective conscience or consciousness. The useful ambiguity of conscience is available in English, but in Indonesia, the pattern of official life and the framework of popular sentiment within which its seats have become so disjointed that the activities of government, though centrally important, seem nevertheless almost beside the point, mere routinisms, convulsed again and again by sudden eruptions from the screened off, one almost wants to say repressed, political course along which the country is in fact moving. The more accessible events of public life, political facts in the narrower sense do about as much to obscure discourse as to reveal it, insofar as they reflect it, as of course they do. They do so obliquely and indirectly, as dreams reflect desires of ideologies, interests. Desires or ideologies' interests. Discerning it is more like interpreting a constellation of symptoms that tracing a chain of causes. The studies in the whole book therefore diagnose and assess rather than measure and predict. Fragmentation in the party system bespeaks an intensification of ethnic self-consciousness, enfeeblement of formal law, renewed commitment to conciliatory methods of dispute settlements. Behind the moral quandaries of provincial modernizers lie complexities in traditional accounts of tribal history. Behind the explosiveness of rural protests and enthrallment with cataclysmic images of change, behind the theatrics of guided democracy, archaic conceptions of the sources of authority. Taking together these exercises in political exegesis begin to expose the fate outlines of what the Indonesian Revolution in fact amounts to, an effort to construct a modern state in contact with its citizens' conscience, a state with which they can, in both senses of the word, come to an understanding. One of the things Sukarno was right about, though in fact he had something rather different in mind, was that it is this revolution not over. 3. The classical problem of legitimacy. How do some men come to be credited with the right to rule over others? In particularly acute in a country in which long-term colonial domination created a political system that was national in scope but not in complexion. For a state to do more than administer privilege and defend itself against its own population, its acts must seem continuous with the selves of those whose state is pretends it is its citizens to be in some steeped out, amplified sense their acts. This is not a mere question of consensus. A man does not have to agree with the government's acts to see himself as embodied in them any more than he has to prove of his own acts to acknowledge that he has as himself performed them. It is a question of immediacy, of experiencing what the state does, as proceeding naturally from a familiar and intelligible we. A certain amount of psychological sleight of hand is always required to be part of government and citizenry in the best of cases. But when a country has been governed for 200 years or so by foreigners, it is even after they have been displaced a yet more difficult trick. The political task that loomed so formidable as independence was reached for, ending the domination of outside powers, creating leadership cadres, stimulating economic growth, and sustaining a sense of national unity, have indeed turned out to be that, and more since independence has been gained, but they have been joined by another task, less clearly envisaged then and less consciously reorganized now, that of dispelling the aura of alienness from the institution of modern government. Much of the symbol mongering that went on under the Sukarno's regime, and which have been moderated rather than ended under its own successor, was a half-deliberate attempt to close the cultural gulf between the state and society that, if not altogether created by colonial rule, had been enormously widened by it. The great crescendo of slogans, monuments, and demonstrations, which reaches a pitch of almost hysterical intensity in the early 60s, was, in part anyway, designed to make the nation-state seem indigenous. As it was not indigenous, these beliefs and disordered spiraled upward together, and Sukarno was destroyed, along with his regime, in the collapse which ensued. Even without the complicating factor of colonial rule, however, the modern state will seem alien to local tradition in a country like Indonesia, if only because such state's conception of itself as a specialized instrument for the coordination for all aspects of public life has no real counterpart in such a tradition. Traditional rulers, and not only in Indonesia, may have been, when they could manage it and were so inclined, despotic, arbitrary, selfish, unresponsive, exploitative, or merely cruel. Though under the influence of the Cecil B. DeMille view of history, the degree to which they were has commonly been exaggerated, but they never imagined it themselves, nor did their subjects imagine them to be executive of an omnicompetent state. Mostly they governed to proclaim their status, protect, or, where possible, enlarge their privileges and exercise their style of life. And insofar as they regulated matters beyond their immediate reach, which has commonly very little, they did so only derivatively as a reflex of concerns more satisfactory than properly political. The notion that the state is a machine whose function is to organize the general interest comes into such a context as something of a strange idea. So far as a popular reaction is concerned, the results of that strangeness have been the usual ones: a degree of curiosity, a degree more of fear, heightened expectancy, and a great deal of puzzlement. It was so much a confusion of sentiment that Sukarno's symbol wielding was failed response. But the various matters discussed in the whole book are others, less concocted, so less ephemeral. In them, one can see in concrete detail what, being abruptly confronted with the prospects of an activist, comprehensive central government that the Juvenal has called the powerhouse state, means to a people uses to master but not to managers. Such a confrontation means that the received concepts of justice, power, protest, authenticity, identity, as well, of course, as a host of other these essays do not explicitly treat, are all thrown into jeopardy by the requirements or seeming such of effective national existence in the contemporary world. This conceptual dislocation, the putting into question of the most familiar frames of moral and intellectual perception, and the vast shift of sensibility thereby setting in motion, forms the proper subject of cultural studies of new state politics. What this country needs, Sukarno once said, is a characteristic burst of linguistic syncretism, is key up to date, and he didn't quite give in that, merely gestures toward it, but they were gestures graphic enough to convince all but the most provincial of Indonesians that not just the form but the nature of government had changed, and that they had, in result, some mental adjustments to make. Fourth, this sort of social changing of the mind is a great deal easier to sense than to document, not only because its manifestations are so very various and indirect, but because it is so hesitant, so true with uncertainty and contradiction. For every belief, practice, ideal, or institution that is condemned as backward one, often the same one as by the same people, is celebrated as the very essence of contemporaneity. For everyone attacked as alien, one, again often the same one, is hailed as a sacred expression of the national soul. There is, in such matters, no simple progression from traditional to modern, but a twisting, spasmodic, unmethodical movement which turns as often toward repossessing the emotions of the past and dissolving them. Some of Santoro's peasants rate their future in medieval myths, some in Marxist visions, some in both. Left's lawyers waver between the formal dispassion of justice scales and the sheltering paternalism of the banyan tree. The publicist whose career Abdullah traces as an example of his society's reaction to the challenge of modernism editorializes simultaneously from the restoration of the genuine Minangkabau at that custom, and for headlong entry onto the path of kemajuan progress. In Java, Anderson finds archaic magical and developed rational theories of power existing side by side. In Sumatra, Liddell finds localism and nationalism advancing pari passu. This undeniable, commonly denied fact